All right, hi everyone. How's it going? And welcome to another video. Now, today I want to do a video that's going to be a bit different than the videos I have done in the past. Today I want to talk about the archaeological field school that I attended last summer, the summer of 2021. Now, after I had attended the archaeological field school, I did think about doing a video on it. However, I just never got around to it. One thing led to another, and I just never got around to making a video on it. However, a friend of mine wanted to do a podcast of him interviewing me about my archaeological field school experience. So we did this podcast, did the interview, and then because I had researched a lot of information that, some of which I had forgotten, I thought, okay, now is a good time to do a video on this. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do this video on today. Now, one thing I want to mention, and I don't think I've mentioned this before, but my major in college was anthropology. So I was an anthropology major, took a lot of cultural anthropology classes, and took archaeology classes. And the archaeology at the time was a little bit of a turnoff for me. I had taken a class, we had done a CD-ROM program. I know I'm dating myself now, but we did do a CD-ROM program, and I remember not really liking the program a whole lot. And I remember at the time I just wasn't really interested in archaeology. A friend of mine was going on an archaeological field school. This was in the summer of 1998. I didn't attend. I believe it was because I had classes I was going to be taking, but I just didn't really care to do it at the time. However, fast forward a number of years, and I've really gotten into archaeology. I have read a number of articles and books, and I'll watch YouTube channels of archaeologists, some of them saying very interesting things. I'm also really into history. There was an archaeologist who worded it perfectly by saying that when you actually do history, if you were to make history something that you wouldn't just read out of a book or watch movies and videos on, if you were to actually do history, you would do archaeology. So I thought that was interesting when they said that. I do agree with that. The way you actually do history is you do archaeology. So, anyways, at this point, I was thinking about going to an archaeological field school. And, the reason why is because I had gotten more into it. Also, being that I'm an anthropology major, there could be some possible employment opportunities down the road, such as archaeological technician positions. So I thought I would look for a field school. I had started kind of late in my search, and I wasn't really finding much. I was kind of late, like I said, and couldn't really find too many things. Finally, I stumbled across the CAA, Center for American Archaeology, and I saw that they had an adult field school, they called it. It was 4 weeks. If you only wanted to go 1 week, that was fine. You could just go 1 week. But I signed up for 4 weeks. And then at the end, I liked it so much that they offered a free 5th week, and I stayed a 5th week. And there was only one other person besides myself who stayed all 5 weeks. And, that was because, other people had to get back to school and whatnot or work. But I was able to stay all 5 weeks, and I'm glad I did. I really liked this whole experience a lot. So I think the best way to start about talking about the um, field school and the Center for American Archaeology would be to tell a little bit about the history of it and to talk about the Koster site, which is what made this field school famous. So I do want to talk about that because that was a very famous dig that took place pretty much the entire 70s decade. So now the Center for American Archaeology was founded by Stuart Striever. Stuart Striever was a professor of anthropology at Northwestern University, and he had started this, and my understanding is he began looking into archaeological sites in the lower Illinois Valley area, the lower Illinois Valley. And he had found some sites. He excavated some sites around Kempsville, Illinois, which is located in Calhoun County, the third most remote county in the state, just about 40 miles or so north of St. Louis. And he established the headquarters for the Center of American Archaeology in Kempsville. He had bought a number of buildings, but more on that later. What had happened was in 1967, he had been tipped off by a friend of his, an individual, a farmer named Helton. Helton told him of a farm called the Koster farm that was near where he lived, and that there were artifacts being found in the cornfield. Quite a few. So Stuart Striever looked into it with his friend, an individual by the name of Craig Perno, who, from what I understand, did not have an archaeology degree, but was very knowledgeable, super knowledgeable in mortuary practices of Native Americans and mounds and all that. So much so that he became an archaeologist at the Gilchrist Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, even though Craig Perno didn't, have a degree in the subject, but he was like one of the most knowledgeable of like Native American burial practices in the country. Anyways, Stuart Striever and Craig Perno began digging some like test pits, and then they took a probe and stuck the probe into the ground, pulled up a bunch of like a black dirt sample. The soil was dark, and that was indication that there was an occupation there, that there was a site. Because if the soil's clear and sterile soil, that means, people weren't there. The dark soil is the result of decaying organic matter. So what then happened, they began excavating the site in 1969 for a few weeks, and then in 1970, they pretty much hit it full blast. They had started, Striever had the field school come to the site, and he had university students digging there, university students from Northwestern, but I believe people were coming from all over because Stuart Striever was also very good at selling archaeology. And he had this concept. I don't know if I would call it pay to play. I don't want to necessarily call it that. Maybe that's too harsh a term. But what it was before in the past, if you wanted to do archaeology, you pretty much had to go to a university and you had to go to a field school, or you had to just know an archaeologist. Well, here, you could pay to have an archaeological experience. And not everyone understood this concept, but I do understand it because archaeology is kind of a rare experience. It's just not something you would do every day. Most people will never do it, and he's giving people an opportunity, people who are not in a university, to do archaeology. So I definitely felt that that was like a great system that he had. If you wanted to do archaeology, this was your chance. You could go to the Center for American Archaeology and you could go on a dig to the Koster site. Now, in around 1973, the New York Times put out an article on the Koster site calling it the biggest find in archaeological history in North America. And Stuart Strever was interviewed. People throughout the country got real interested in wanting to check out this Koster site. At this point, they had dug down about 34 feet, and it was a very large operation. And just to say a little bit about that, I do want to get into what people usually talk about when they talk about the findings of the Koster site, and that was the fact that the Koster site could best be looked at as kind of like a fossilized layer cake. It's usually what people will say. So, first you had the early archaic people who had settled there, and that would go back around 9,500 years. There were 14 different horizons. Those are occupations. A horizon is an occupation. Think of it as a village. There were 14 different horizons. There may have been more, but more on that later. But there were 14 different horizons. You had the early archaic people. They had settled there, and then they left the site. Then slope wash and mud from down the bluffs came, covered the whole site with clear soil. So then another group of people came in, the middle archaic, and they settled there. Then after them, then you had the same thing happen. The slope wash covered the site, preserving it. Then after them, you had the late archaic, and same thing, slope wash came after they left the site. Then you had the woodland people, the early woodland people, same thing as I said. Then the middle woodland people and the late woodland people. So the site ended up getting perfectly preserved in this like layer cake, like I said. Usually you don't have that in archaeological sites, I've been told. Usually they're not well preserved because the different layers, the different horizons will bleed into one another. Here the conditions were such to allow for a covering of soil, a protective covering of soil after each occupation. So after each occupation of people, there was a protective covering of soil. That is what preserved the site so well. And they were able to find out a lot about the people who had lived there. They went down 34 feet, 14 horizons, 14 different occupations. They believed there were more. However, due to safety concerns, they couldn't go any deeper because they needed more equipment. They needed to build structures to hold the walls in place so the site didn't collapse. It was just getting kind of dangerous. And Stuart Strever went around. He went on various like news shows and whatnot. He was on NBC Today talking about it, and he was talking about how they were probably going to have to stop if they couldn't get better, safety mechanisms in place. So, yeah, he was going around talking about this. A lot of articles at the time. A lot of visitors came to the site because of the New York Times article and many other articles in newspapers. One year in the 70s, I know there were 30,000 people that had come to visit the site. There was even a bus of Japanese college students that came all the way from Japan to see the site. So word got out about this site from all over the world. People wanted to check out this Koster site. And if you want to know more about the Koster site, I'll talk a little more about it. But I'm going to talk about a few other things. But I highly recommend this book right here, Koster, Americans in Search of Their Prehistoric Past. Highly recommend checking this out. It's written by Stuart Strever. It came out the very beginning of 1979, around the time they had finished excavating the site. The site was then backfilled, but not before they found quite a few things. I mean, lots of arrowheads and spear points. They found the oldest dog burials that were 7,100 years old, domesticated dogs. They hadn't found that before. And here's a picture right here of one that they had found. This one was found around, I'm not sure what horizon, but this one was said to be 6,000 years old. And it is, as you can see, a dog burial. No one knows really what the grinding stone was used for by the dog's head. But as you can see, it's probably a better angle right here. As you can see, there's like a grinding stone by the dog's head. They don't know what that is, but they did find this dog burial at the site, and I'm told about 6 others as well. And some of them going back, 7,100 years. They also found evidence of the earliest permanent houses in North America at 7,000 years old. Earliest permanent houses. Now, from what I understand, there's a site called the Galt site that's 30 miles north of Austin, Texas. And I believe in fact, they claim that they have found a house that's 12,000 years old, like a permanent house. But at the time, yeah, that was the oldest house that had been found in North America. And they also had the oldest cemetery found in the eastern part of North America, going back 8,400 years. A cemetery. Now, the cemeteries that they found were usually people that were of a lower social status. They believe that people that were of a higher social status were buried in the bluffs somewhere. I don't believe they ever found the site. But there are burial mounds, all throughout the area. And from what I understand with the burial mounds, one might think that they were just like mounds of dirt with people put in them. They're actually very elaborate. They would make a very elaborate crypt, like a wooden crypt. They would usually be buried with a number of different objects, some of them quite intricate. I'll talk a little more about that in a bit, but yeah, it's just a very, very extensive site. Like I said, a lot of people were coming to it. There are a lot of findings. Here's a picture of it, and this is the Koster site. And I'll get into the site that I dug at in just a moment. But some interesting findings. Now, to tell you a bit about the people that were there now, the site that I dug at was called the German site. And it doesn't have to do with the German, nationality, but it has to do with the name of the people who had found the site. The site was actually first documented in the late 60s. It was also documented in the 70s, and they started excavating it in 2019. And I was there 2021. Don't believe there was too much done in 2020, except for in the fall there might have been a little bit. But when I was there, it was more extensive in the summer of 2021. And we were excavating a late woodland site. And the years on that were 800 AD to 1200 AD. Roughly corresponding with the European Viking Age, give or take a century or two. In fact, someone there was studying in college the Viking Age. And I remember saying this is perfect because this is essentially the Viking Age. Even though it's not in Scandinavia, it's that time period, give or take a century or two, like I said. But, anyways, yeah, now the late woodland people, there were two phases of it, or two time periods. There was an earlier one that started around 400 AD and went to 800 AD. That's known as the Whitehall late woodland period. And then you have the Jersey Bluff late woodland period. Now, the one of the first late woodland houses that was mapped and excavated, from what I understand, was excavated by an individual by the name of Vern Wetterson, and he had written about it in his 1983 PhD dissertation. Now, Vern Wetterson was a professor I had in college at one of the schools I attended, which was North Park University in Chicago. And he was one of my professors. He never brought up the fact that he had, gone on this dig and had, documented a late woodland house. He never brought that up. A lot of times professors don't. So I was completely unaware of it until I read some readings about it. I'm like, oh, yeah, that was one of my professors in college. So, yeah, anyways, like I said, it was a late woodland site. Now, before the late woodland, and I do want to gonna talk right now a bit about the people. Before the late woodland people, you have the middle woodland people. They built more mounds, a lot of mounds, and they were known for their very decorative objects. All kinds of decorative things that they would find. They found they found pipes, they found decorative pottery, much more decorative. The middle woodland people were much more decorative in anything they made than the late woodland. Although the late woodland had a more advanced, like pottery technology, they were a bit more advanced. The stuff they made was not as decorative. It was more functional. Everything like had more of a function to it, and there's different reasons why that was the case. Um, Generally, could be believed that the middle woodland people and the people before that had more leisure time because the Illinois River Valley, the lower Illinois River Valley, had all kinds of food resources. There were duck potatoes, there were all kinds of nuts, hickory, hazel, walnuts. There was deer, rabbits, raccoons, bear, all kinds of things to hunt. Um, all sorts of food. There was fish, waterfowl. For fishing, they would actually make fish hooks out of bone, out of deer bone. They would also use plant fibers. It's believed they would do this. It hasn't been proven though, but they would use plant fibers to make nets, it's believed, and they would net fish out of these like backwater pools that connected to the river because this is right by the Illinois River. So it's believed they would, take these nets. Stuart Strever did an experiment to see how much fish he could net in these backwater pools. And very quickly, in almost no time at all, he had 300 fish in a net. So, yeah, they could easily get a lot of fish. There were other things they were getting seeds from. Sunflowers and marsh elder was another thing. So, all kinds of food resources because they had so much food and because food was just so prevalent and abundant, they were not engaging in agriculture. They had the knowledge of corn, beans, and squash and how to grow it, but they didn't have to grow it. And, there's a lot of changes that take place when a society shifts from hunter gatherer to agriculture. And there was no need for them to make those changes. They remained hunter gatherers, and yet, even though they were hunter gatherers, they lived in permanent settlements. They had permanent houses. They were not nomadic. That was not known before. Before Koster, that was not known. It was believed that hunter gatherers were nomadic, that they traveled around, like the Plains Native Americans, that they had traveled. But what they found here were permanent houses, permanent house basins. And it's believed that these houses were made, they're generally around 8 by 12 feet long. I believe some longer ones have been found. They would dig a ditch, and in the ditch, they would put these posts. Now, you would find at a lot of these sites post molds, evidence of there having had been posts buried in the ground. So, they would then stick these posts in the ditch. They would then take twigs, interlace the twigs, and then once they had kind of the framework of a wall, they would use mud, like a mud plaster, so like mud and clay, and then make the walls real thick. And then the doors were believed to be either thatched mats or animal skins, and they also had like a thatched roof. That's how it's generally believed that these people, the woodland peoples, had built their houses. So that's how it's believed that they had done it. And I know they found some burnt clay. I guess maybe a house might have burnt down. So they had an idea of how they were building these houses. And once built, one of these houses could last about 40 years or so. And another thing they claimed, they also had made canoes as well. So they had canoes, just, so many different things. And if you do think about it, they were actually very sophisticated in a lot of ways. The skill set that they would have had, and I know a lot of people talk about, skill sets today, but the skill set that they would have had would have been quite large, would have been quite vast. Anything, excuse me, anything you wanted, you made. So, whether it was a drum, uh, spears, arrowheads, atlatls, which is a spear thrower, anything you wanted, you made. Blades, they would make their arrowheads and blades and spear points out of chert. Chert is a form of flint, like a settlement that like builds up over time. And there's chert all over this area. Chert everywhere. It's called Burlington Chert. In fact, one of the students even said they should call it the Burlington Chert Factory. But yeah, you have a lot of this like white Burlington chert, and that's what they would use. Now, like I said, they had all the food they needed. Because they had all the food they needed, they did not have to be nomadic, and they did not have to engage in agriculture, even though they had knowledge of it. There was no need to implement it. They didn't have to. They had all they needed. In a way, you could say that for thousands of years, they were kind of living in at least the closest thing I've ever heard of to like a utopia. You don't often hear of a utopia. People will tell you that it doesn't exist. Yet, sounds like the closest thing I've ever heard to people living in kind of a utopia. Now, what would then happen? And my theory is because food was so abundant and people were, life was pretty good. Life was pretty good for a while. There's that misconception of hunter gatherers always living in this like state of survival. like it kind of being something almost reminiscent of like a Robert E. Howard Conan book or something, where they're constantly in this struggle for survival and life would be very difficult and short. And that just apparently was not the case here for a long time. People had what they needed. Now, what I believe had happened was that word got out that this was a great place to live. And as word got out, the villages went from 50 to 100 people to over 1,000 people. The villages sprang up. In order to support the larger population, they then had to implement agriculture for the first time on a large scale. Once you do that, you change the land, and once you work the land, it creates a sense of ownership. So then if other people come on the land, come to the land and try to take it, you would be more willing to defend it. And that's what happened. That's what, I believe happened. There is evidence of warfare happening, but warfare only happens in the late woodland period, the period from 800 AD to 1200 AD. That's where you have warfare for the first time. And what had happened was they found skeletons that have had arrowheads lodged into them. So they assumed that there was warfare going on, and maybe that's what caused the site to be abandoned in 1200 AD. It's known that it was abandoned. What happened, they really don't know. It could have been that because what you have here is it's like a valley, so you have like flat land with these big cliff bluffs surrounding it. And that might have made, defending the village difficult. People could be firing arrows from the bluffs down upon the village, and there would have been little they could do about it. So that's believed to be one of the reasons why they left. Was another theory that they had run out of resources, they ran out of firewood. It's believed that some of the occupations, the people had just run out of firewood, and that's why they left. But for thousands of years, people would stay at the site, they would be there, then they would leave. Now, there was a horizon at the Koster site, Horizon 6, the sixth, occupation there that was very thick. It was like 5 feet thick. They found many, many artifacts in this, all kinds of pottery and arrowheads and spear points. And it's believed that that was actually 3 consecutive occupations, one after another. There was no sterile soil between because it was one after another. There wasn't time for the sterile soil to build up. So you had that happen. There was also indication at one point that a hunting camp was there and that they didn't stay long. So, yeah, just a lot of different things had happened, a lot of changes, and it caused them to leave. It's believed also maybe some people left because they had used all the firewood in the area. There's a theory of that. But, anyways, so that, was the Koster site. And, those are some of the theories behind it and what you had happening there. Now, the site I was at, like I said, was the German site. They've only been excavating it relatively recently. There was a flood in 2019, and they were unable to go to the site they wanted to go to. So they went to another site that was only about 1.5 miles away from Kempsville, and called the German site. And that was where we had excavated. Now, there's about 8 other sites surrounding it. And in order to find the site, because it could be very difficult where you want to put the squares when you dig an archaeological site. So the site director, an individual by the name of Jason King, had used a magnetometer. And the magnetometer would show anomalies like in the soil, so you could see where a house basin might be or where a hearth would be, a storage pit, a cooking pit, roasting pits, all sorts of things. And he put the squares, the excavation squares, which I believe were around, I don't know, something like 12 by 12 feet or so, from what I can remember. And you put these squares on these house basins, and that's what we were digging. So we're digging these house basins, and there were some interesting finds. So there was a turtle shell that was found when we were there. There was a stone axe that had been found. That was probably the coolest find, I thought, was the stone axe. They found the top of a deer skull, a deer cranium, arrowheads, lots of pottery. Lots of pottery, and they're called sherds. Not to be confused with shard. Shard would be glass. With pottery, it's called sherd. But yeah, lots of different, pottery. Well, all kinds. Yeah, all kinds of stuff like that. I know they also found like shirt blades, and you can see that shirt is ordinarily white, but when it's heat treated, it becomes like a reddish color. So we were just in the unit I was in doing like a wall scrape because you have to make the walls of the unit completely even. And if they're not even, then you have to do it again. Same with the floor of the unit. Everything has to be level and even. Well, at one point, we were just scraping the side and a little shirt blade popped out. And to me, that was great. I mean, that was just a great moment. To be the first to touch an artifact in probably about 1,000 years. I mean, no one had touched that in 1,000 years, and you're the first to touch it in such a long period of time. And that's just such a great experience to experience that. But yeah, quite a few things were found. Now, interesting thing I do want to mention, in 2019, they found some pottery sherds that, broken pieces of pottery that were tempered. Because, when you cook a pot, you have to have like a temper in it, something to like hold it together. Well, the temper used in these potsherds was crushed shell. Well, the late woodland people wouldn't use shell, but the Mississippians would. The Mississippians being the people who built Cahokia. And this site is not too far from Cahokia. I believe maybe around 60 miles or so. So one thing they've always been trying to figure out is how were these late woodland people interacting with the people of Cahokia. That's not entirely known. There is a belief that they were growing massive amounts of crops, like particularly corn, and that the corn was supplying Cahokia. That the late woodland people were growing corn, and they were then giving it to the Mississippians, and this was supplying the city of Cahokia, which was very heavily populated at one time, had a population greater than that of London. At one point, it was estimated as many as 30 to 40,000 people were living there. So, yeah, that's interesting. They're not sure how the Mississippians were interacting with the late woodland people. What was going on? Was there some assimilation going on? Were they resisting something? Or, was it sort of like a supply depot? Was it that they were supplying corn? Were they supplying chert? A lot of stone tools were made using chert. So, could that have been the case? Excuse me. So, yeah, I mean, just, a lot going on here, a lot of questions they were trying to answer. And they didn't find any Mississippian artifacts when I was there. It was just late woodland. But in 2019, like I said, they found those sherds with the shell temper. But yeah, so like I said, we did find quite a few things. Then, just to tell you a bit about the excavation itself, we would dig, and I believe it was about 7 centimeters at the time. We would then have to measure to make sure the floor of the unit was completely level. If you went a little lower, you'd have to make the whole thing level. So you'd have to then make the whole thing level, completely level it off. And sometimes that could be time consuming. But I like like I said, I really like the whole experience. It didn't matter to me. And what you do is you would then, put the dirt that you would shovel into a bucket, pour the bucket onto a screener, and then screen things. If you found something, you would then put it in a bag. Later on, you would catalog it using their system, and they would go over all that with you. You would have to write, the site where it was found, um, the number of like what it was associated with, whether it was like cultural shatter, if it was a flake. So a lot of times you wouldn't actually find an artifact. You would find a flake that broke off from when they were making an artifact. So that would be quite common. There was a lot of flakes, and you got to understand too, is, a lot of times people were learning how to make arrowheads and spear points and all that. And in the process of learning that, there would be some trial and error, and maybe they'd make a lot of flakes and all that. I know, and I believe it was in Michigan. They've actually found evidence of people learning how to make pots from the late woodland period. They were not well made. They were just probably younger people learning how to do it for the first time. So, yeah, another interesting thing I do want to add is I said that the middle woodland period was different from the late woodland period, and that the middle woodland period you have more artifacts that were more decorative. One of the things they did find, and they found this in a process known as flotation. Now, Stuart Strever is the innovator of floating. And floating is done by archaeologists all over the world. And what it is you take like a flotation bag, put it into like a barrel that had like a window screen on it to separate the seeds and charcoal and other small things from the rest of the dirt. And you could find different things, seeds. Well, at one point they found a little figurine when they were excavating, and I believe it was a location between Quincy, Illinois and Jacksonville, somewhere between there. And it was middle woodland, and it was this little figurine. It could fit on a penny. They called it Smiling Dan. You can see there's like a lump on its head. At first, you wonder what the lump is. Then, from what I've been told, the lump is actually a top knot. The men wore their hair in top knots. So, yeah, just kind of, interesting what you could find. You never know what you're going to find. That was a major find. It was found in a little clump of dirt. If, someone had not grabbed that clump, they never would have found that figurine. So, quite a find. You never know what you're going to find. That's why you got to screen a lot of things, because you never know what could be found. You just don't. Could find something very interesting. But anyways, yeah. So floating, like I said, Stuart Strever, the founder of the Center for American Archaeology, is the innovator of floating. And he really, from what I understand, he wanted to be kind of like cutting edge. He in the 1970s, he was one of only like two archaeologists in the country to implement computers. So they were using computers, and it was very involved. The one of the reasons why they chose Campsville for all of this was because with Campsville, you could buy houses pretty cheap, and they would use these houses as different labs. So Stuart Strever set up a botany lab, and he had a zoology lab, and there was, all different things, studying bones, and all sorts of stuff. A computer lab, and the computers, these were 70s computers they were using at the time. And from what I understand, there was like a turn part of it was located in Campsville, and another part was a terminal that was located in Northwestern University. So yeah, this is some of the earlier stages in computing. They were using punch cards and stuff. Another thing they would study quite heavily. Now you got to understand, Stuart Strever was a part of an archaeological movement. It's been referred to as New Archaeology. And the idea behind that was you don't just study the artifacts to find out about people. You just kind of study everything. You study seeds. You can learn a lot about the people and the environment in which they lived in. There was an emphasis on environment with the New Archaeology movement. So you'd study the environment. You study the seeds. You study pollen. You study charcoal, just to get an idea of what the environment was like, so you could understand how the people were living and thriving in their environment. A lot of things you could learn about, studying plants from this site. I know he had a ethnobotanist, a woman. I think she may have been from Maine. Her name was Nancy. From what I understand, she was there for quite some time. She had a husband as well. And you'll see them in various videos about the Center for American Archaeology, some of the older ones. I believe his name was Dave. He was an archaeologist. And, she would study the plants that the people would use. I'm told that they would use about 300 in over 300 plants for medicine. They use about 130 plants for food, and about 27 or so were smoked. So, lot of different things. It wasn't just tobacco. There were like, many other things, many other different types of plants that they would smoke. So, yeah, lot of things, going on here. But with the whole new archaeology movement, you'd study all kinds of things, even snails, because supposedly with snails you could find out a lot about an environment, because different species of snails will live in different types of environments. So yeah, a lot of different things. They would study, like I said, there was a zoology lab. They'd study the different types of animals. From what I understand, is that there was no evidence of buffalo being there yet. Buffalo have been reported in Illinois, but I think it was much later that herds were coming in, maybe around the 1500s. There's not really evidence that they were making use of buffalo, but there were buffalo in Illinois. I believe the last one was killed around 1837, but in Illinois. But you had other things like the passenger pigeon, which went extinct, and a cold weather parrot called the Carolina parakeet. Wasn't a parakeet; it was an actual cold weather parrot that went extinct in the earlier part of the 20th century. I don't think they've seen any since. But yeah, anyways, yeah, just interesting to see this, the new archaeology movement. and all that. But yeah, like I said, we were at the German site, and it is hot work if you do this. It was very hot. I In doing it the first week, I don't want to say I hated it, but I was kind of afraid because I felt all this back pain, and I was wondering, am I going to be in pain the whole time? Will this pain go away? But yeah, I felt some kind of severe back pain, took some Tylenol, and then I was okay for the rest of the time. So yeah, that wasn't a big deal. But well, I was nervous at first because of that, because of feeling this back pain. But yeah, I know, some people really liked doing this. Other people did not. There were some people that were counting down the hours on their phone to when they could leave. But I wasn't one of those people. I loved every minute of it. And there was a dorm you stay at. We stayed at the McDougal dorm, named after Genevieve McDougal, who had formed a partnership with Stuart Strever. She was a middle school teacher, English teacher in Winnetka, Illinois. She formed a partnership with Stuart Strever to where she could bring middle school students to the site, and they would dig. So yeah, and anyways, you know, like I said though, some people really liked it, some didn't. Yeah, but I liked it quite a bit. As far as bringing equipment, they would give you a list of everything you needed to bring. Definitely needed a water bottle. That was your lifeline. I mean, without it, I think you're kind of in trouble. You definitely needed the water bottle. I mean, that was a lifesaver to me to have the water because it did get very hot. Some days it was so hot we couldn't even go out and excavate. We would stay in and, bag and tag. One time we took a field trip to Cahokia. I know that. There were days where it rained and we had to bail units out with these milk carton balers. You'd have to bail them out because there would be a lot of rain. Sometimes sides of the walls of the units would collapse. You would have that. Um, so yeah, I can recall toward the end, especially as a lot of people had left. There weren't a lot of people there. We had to bail out all the units. But again, you know, I loved every minute of it. I can't complain. I really liked this. Some ways, maybe I wish I had done this sooner, but I don't know. You kind of discover things when you discover them, right? And maybe there's a reason for that. One that I don't fully understand, but maybe there is. But yeah, anyways, also I should mention food. There's a place called The Landing where, you could get, where you would have food. You'd have 3 meals a day. Again, it was hot work, so even though you would eat 3 meals a day, you'd still end up losing some weight because of that. But yeah, another thing I should mention about Center for American Archaeology is that you do have different programs. I was in the adult field school. Since I've been there recently, they added another program, and it's a program really focusing on people who want to get jobs in the CRM industry as archaeological technicians. And they didn't have that's new, but it does focus on the different phases of archaeology. So, phase one, phase two, phase three. What we did and what I did was phase three archaeology, but they supposedly focus on all of it. There's also an advanced field school. Depending on what branch of that you're in, you may not do a dig. So, just be aware of that, research that before you go. But yeah, there were other things they had there. They had like an archaeology day. where we showed how to clean artifacts, because that was another thing you would do. You would clean the artifacts and then bag and tag them. So there was a lot of that. You would do a lot of that. But I didn't mind any of that. I liked learning that and learning how to categorize different things. And then you would put them in bins. But yeah, it was really a cool experience. So that's all I've got. I just wanted to tell you about this archaeology field school that I went on, and a bit about the history of it and what had happened here. One other thing I probably should mention now before I end this video, I want to add another thing about the late woodland people that I was talking about. These are the people that we were excavating. It was a late woodland site, Jersey Bluff phase. Remember, I said there were two phases: the Whitehall, which came before that, and then the Jersey Bluff. But interesting thing too is that they were the first people in the area to implement the bow and arrow. So I should add that around 800 AD, they began using the bow and arrow. Before that, they would use spears. I had heard some mention of the fact that they would often run deer down with their hunting dogs, and then they would use their atlatls, their spears. But once, after 800 AD, the late woodland period, Jersey Bluff phase, they began using bow and arrows. So I did want to mention that before I end the video. But that's all I've got. As always, if you watched this video, I do thank you for watching. Have a good night.